Hello, welcome back. For this week's code exercise, we're going to work from the example we developed, and I'm going to give you a few pointers where you might want to think about making some changes. So this is the code we built this week. It's a little melodic kind of ambient idea that sounds, something like that, where we have some chords playing, and then over top we add melodic sequence, a couple of melodic sequences, fret to a delay, and then we have a constant bass drone kind of rounding things off in the low end. So there's a few ways this example is generative, right? So one is, of course, the chord sequence is completely random. So this actual next chord being played, right, is completely random here. So you could think about, other ways that you could drive which chord to go to next. So oftentimes, one way that we can start to shape these generative systems is by just adding further constraints. So for example, one thing to think about could be, could you pick a chord, the next chord that you play, make sure that it has at least one note from the current chord. That's often a rule being used in music to change from one chord to the next and make the transition a little bit smoother. So we could think about, instead of completely random over here, we could have some further rules that could define, which chord can go next. Of course, at the very least, one thing that you could play with is just use this framework we created to explore, different melodies that you could create, coming up with just trying different sequences here of notes and different rhythmic pattern, different note durations, different tempos, right? There's lots of things we can play with, different offsets, and of course, different scales altogether. So, without changing too much of the code, you could use that as a framework just to create your own version of that composition. Another place that you can spend some time playing with, and again, as we're getting to know Tone.js a little better, is tweaking some of the parameters of these synths, maybe trying different types of synths, both for the chords, but also for the melodic motifs. Here we're just using an AM synth. Maybe we could have a different one. And then finally, something else you could also choose to focus on this week would be experimenting with different visualization. So here I use an FFT and then created this circular pattern. What other ways could we represent this melody? Of course, you don't have to do all these things. These are just pointers for you to start exploring in this week's code exercise. This is a fairly complex program, so you don't have to build something like this from scratch. Instead, these are just places where you can branch off and try to work your sort of coding skills at the same time. So I'm curious to see what you come up with based on this example, and I'll see you next week.